The neighborhood of Maple Ridge was the kind of place where the lawns were always cut to regulation height. The fences were perfectly aligned, and the mailboxes were identical down to the glossy finish. It was a community built on rules enforced by an HOA that prided itself on maintaining standards. For most residents, that meant keeping their heads down, paying their fees, and pretending not to notice the board members cruising slowly past each house like patrol cars. Ethan Miller had moved to Maple Ridge 3 years earlier, attracted by its quiet streets and reputation for safety. A small business owner who ran a local repair shop, he valued peace and privacy more than anything else. His house sat on a corner lot with a wide, stone, paved driveway, something he'd upgraded himself after buying the property. It was his pride, neatly sealed, edged with red bricks, and spacious enough for 4 cars. The irony was that the same feature he loved most about his home would soon become the spark that ignited a neighborhood war. It started with a letter. A crisp, white envelope with the HOA's seal stamped on the corner slipped neatly into his mailbox one morning. Inside was a formal notice. You are in violation of Section 14C of the Maple Ridge HOA Code, unauthorized parking. Fines will accrue at $25 per day until resolved. Ethan read the letter twice, convinced he had misunderstood. Unauthorized parking on his own driveway. The accusation made no sense. His truck, a beat-up but reliable pickup he used for work, had been parked there every night for years. It wasn't on the street, wasn't blocking anyone's path, and certainly wasn't disturbing the peace. He brushed it off at first, assuming it was a clerical mistake. But when the second letter came a week later, this time with an invoice for $175 in accumulated fines, he realized this was no error. The HOA was dead serious. The reason, as he would soon find out, was hidden deep within the pages of the HOA's covenant, a document thick with legal jargon and small print. There it was, Section 14C, a rule stating that commercial vehicles or vehicles displaying business signage may not be parked within public view. His pickup, with the logo of his repair shop on the door, apparently fell under that category. Ethan's jaw clenched as he read it. His driveway wasn't public view. It was his property. But the HOA disagreed. In their eyes, anything visible from the street was fair game, and to them, his truck, his means of livelihood, was an eyesore. He tried to reason with them. He sent emails, made calls, even attended a board meeting. But the HOA president, a sharp-tongued woman named Carol Benson, stood firm. The rule was the rule. If he wanted to park his truck there, he'd need to remove the business decals or pay the fines. It felt absurd. Here he was, a paying homeowner, being told what he could and couldn't do in his own driveway. Still, he swallowed his frustration at first, determined not to let it get under his skin. He parked his truck on the street for a few nights, until one morning, he found a bright orange ticket on his windshield. The HOA had fined him again, this time for street obstruction. That was the moment something shifted inside him. The fine wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It was an insult. It wasn't about keeping the neighborhood tidy. It was about control. About people like Carol who treated the HOA like their personal kingdom. Ethan began noticing the pettiness everywhere. A neighbor's trash can left an inch too far from the curb got a warning. A garden gnome that didn't match the approved aesthetic was flagged for removal. Even kids' basketball hoops were banned unless they could be folded up and hidden after use. The more he thought about it, the more it burned. The HOA wasn't protecting property values. It was suffocating them. And for the first time, Ethan wondered how far he'd have to go to push back. When the next letter arrived, this time threatening legal action for unpaid fines, Ethan didn't get angry. He got quiet, calm. A different kind of energy took over, one that felt less like outrage and more like strategy. He started reading, researching, digging into HOA laws, local ordinances, and property rights. What he discovered surprised him. While the HOA had power, it wasn't absolute. There were limits, gray areas they avoided mentioning, loopholes they counted on homeowners never finding. That's when he stumbled across an idea. It was small at first, almost a joke in his mind. But the longer he thought about it, the more it made sense. If the HOA wanted to control his driveway so badly, maybe he'd give them a reason to regret it. So, one morning, he walked outside with a measuring tape, clipboard, and a quiet smile. Neighbors peeked through blinds as he measured the length and width of his driveway. To them, it looked like he was planning another renovation. In a way, he was, just not the kind they expected. By the end of the week, Ethan had set up a new listing online. Nothing fancy, just a few photos and a simple description. Private driveway parking for rent. Secure, close to main road, 24/27 access. It was technically legal. The HOA's rules didn't mention renting out private driveways, and there were no city ordinances against it. Within days, he had his first customer, a college student who needed a safe place to park her car overnight. Then another. Then two more. Each one paid him a small fee, enough to cover his fines and then some. Ethan didn't just stop there. He installed small cameras, made sure the renters followed all parking regulations, and kept meticulous records. Everything was above board, every penny traceable. He had turned his driveway, the same one the HOA fined him for, into a legitimate, registered business. And he made sure to let the HOA know. It started as a simple act of defiance, but soon, word spread. Other neighbors began asking questions. A few even asked if he could help them rent out their own driveways. And that's when the HOA realized Ethan's little act of rebellion wasn't just personal anymore. It was contagious. The balance of power in Maple Ridge was starting to shift. And for the first time, Carol Benson didn't look so certain behind her boardroom desk, because Ethan Miller wasn't just fighting back. He was winning. To be continued in Chapter 2. The business that broke the HOA. It started quietly, a single online listing buried among local ads. But by the end of the month, Ethan's driveway had become the most sought-after parking spot in Maple Ridge. His neighborhood was located just minutes from a commuter train station and a small downtown strip where parking was notoriously scarce. People were tired of circling the blocks every morning, desperate to find a space before work. Ethan's driveway offered convenience, safety, and a price cheaper than the town's metered lots. Soon, there were cars parked neatly along the edges of his stone driveway almost every day. They weren't flashy or loud, just normal sedans, compact cars, and the occasional SUV. Ethan kept everything orderly. He sent clear instructions to renters, limited the number of cars to avoid crowding, and made sure the spaces were always tidy. The money started adding up. What began as a way to offset his fines quickly grew into a steady income stream. In a single month, Ethan earned nearly 3 times what the HOA had fined him. And that was just the beginning. But what really got under the HOA's skin wasn't the money. It was the principle. The board members had noticed the unfamiliar cars parked in Ethan's driveway almost immediately. Carol Benson, the HOA president, prided herself on keeping the neighborhood pristine. And to her, those vehicles were an intrusion. She started sending out her usual notices, accusing Ethan of operating a business on residential property. Ethan was ready for her. Every letter she sent, he countered with documentation, city zoning codes, OA bylaws, and correspondence from the county office confirming that renting out private parking was not classified as a commercial enterprise. He even registered a small sole proprietorship under his name, just to make things official. The HOA's threats grew more aggressive, but their arguments fell apart under the weight of his preparation. The irony was delicious. They had weaponized the rulebook against him, and now he was using that same book to tear down their power. Neighbors started to notice his quiet defiance. Some admired it. Others whispered about it during HOA meetings. A few, tired of constant fines for petty things, began asking Ethan how he'd done it. He didn't advertise himself as a hero. He just shared what he knew. One neighbor, a young couple living 2 streets over, followed his example and listed their driveway for rent. Another homeowner with a wide backyard set up a few parking spots accessed by a side gate. Before long, Maple Ridge wasn't just a neighborhood of manicured lawns. It was a patchwork of homeowners quietly rebelling against their own HOA. Carol's control started to slip. The HOA board called emergency meetings, but the more they tried to crack down, the more resistance they faced. Residents were fed up with arbitrary rules. Fines for flower beds, warnings about mailbox paint, citations for leaving trash cans out an hour too long. Ethan's story had become the spark that ignited everyone's buried frustration. To make matters worse for the HOA, Ethan's new business was clean, legitimate, and, most importantly, profitable. The HOA couldn't legally collect dues or impose taxes on his earnings. Every dollar went straight into his pocket, untouchable. Ethan reinvested some of that money back into his property. He resurfaced the driveway, added clear painted lines for designated parking, and even installed a small sign reading, "Reserved. By permit only." It was all done tastefully and within the HOA's aesthetic rules. They couldn't complain without contradicting their own policies. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But behind closed doors, Carol was fuming. She began making unannounced inspections, slowly driving past Ethan's home, taking photos with her phone, hoping to catch him in violation of something. But Ethan had nothing to hide. Every improvement he made was within regulations, every car parked with written consent. At HOA meetings, Carol tried to rally the board to act. She called Ethan's business a threat to community integrity and a slippery slope toward chaos. But her words fell flat. Even her own board members were starting to question her motives. One of them, a man named Roger, quietly asked whether the HOA should focus more on real issues: maintenance, landscaping, community events, instead of hounding residents. Carol snapped at him, insisting that order must be preserved. Ethan watched it all unfold from a distance. He didn't attend the meetings anymore. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. Each day that passed without the HOA winning was a victory in itself. And the best part, his renters loved him. He built a small community out of them. Commuters, students, and locals who treated his property with respect. Some even tipped him extra during holidays. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a sense of control, not over others, but over his own life. He kept meticulous records, every payment logged, every transaction transparent. The HOA tried to involve the city council, claiming Ethan's driveway business violated neighborhood purpose. But the city officials sided with him. The property was private, and his activity didn't disrupt public safety or traffic. That ruling broke something in Carol. The day she received the city's decision, she reportedly stormed out of the HOA office. Witnesses said she spent hours driving around the neighborhood, snapping photos of anything remotely non-compliant. Ethan noticed her car idling outside his home one evening, headlights dimmed. She didn't get out. Just sat there for several minutes before finally pulling away. He knew what was coming next. The HOA wouldn't give up that easily. He had embarrassed them, and people like Carol didn't forgive humiliation. They retaliated quietly. Through paperwork and policy changes, he started receiving oddly worded letters about new proposed amendments to the HOA charter, rules designed to restrict third-party use of residential driveways. But changes like that required a vote, a neighborhood vote. And by now, the tide of opinion had turned. Ethan's quiet rebellion had become a movement. Dozens of residents who once feared the HOA now questioned its authority. They attended meetings, demanded transparency, and refused to rubber stamp every proposal. The board had ruled through fear for years, but fear was losing its grip. Ethan didn't celebrate openly. He simply watched as the structure of control started to crack. For every rule Carol tried to impose, another homeowner pushed back. What began as one man's frustration had become a slow, unstoppable shift. a collective awakening in a community that had forgotten what ownership really meant. Still, Ethan knew this wasn't over. Carol wasn't the kind of person to surrender quietly. She'd lost the first few battles, but she was planning something bigger. Something designed to strike back hard and fast. And soon, Ethan would find out just how far the HOA was willing to go to regain control. The calm didn't last long. For a few short weeks, Maple Ridge seemed almost peaceful. The HOA had gone quiet, the usual flood of warning letters slowed to a trickle, and residents began to think that maybe, just maybe, the board had finally accepted defeat. But Ethan knew better. Silence from the HOA wasn't peace. It was preparation. The first signs of trouble came in the form of a neatly printed announcement taped to every mailbox in the neighborhood. Special meeting. Proposed amendments to the Maple Ridge HOA Charter. The notice listed a date, time, and a series of vague agenda items. Phrases like community use restrictions and neighborhood integrity clause. To most people, it looked like standard HOA bureaucracy. But Ethan saw what it really was, a trap. The amendments were Carol Benson's counterattack. At the meeting, held in the community clubhouse under the flicker of two bright fluorescent lights, Carol stood at the front like a general before her troops. She'd rewritten large sections of the HOA charter, inserting new rules that were carefully worded, but clearly targeted at Ethan's operation. The proposed changes banned any form of rental or leasing of outdoor property areas for profit. They also introduced a clause allowing the HOA to impose retroactive fines for violations, dating back to the discovery of such activities. In short, it was an attempt to crush Ethan's driveway business and punish him for every dollar he'd already made. The vote was scheduled for the following week. Ethan sat in the back row, arms crossed, watching as Carol spoke about preserving community standards and protecting property values. Her voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable edge of personal venom. She never said his name, but everyone knew who she meant. Some homeowners nodded along, unwilling to make waves. Others shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Ethan, aware of the growing tension. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The meeting was a performance, and Carol was trying to rally support through fear of change, fear of losing control. When the meeting ended, Ethan went home and began to plan his next move. He knew the vote was critical. If the amendments passed, they'd give the HOA power to shut him down permanently. But if they failed, it would be a public humiliation for Carol and her entire board. He needed to make sure the residents saw what was really happening. So he started talking. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, one conversation at a time. On morning walks, while picking up mail, during chance encounters by the community garden. He told neighbors what the amendments really meant, that the HOA could start fining anyone for using their own property in unapproved ways. That the rules wouldn't just target him, they'd target everyone. He reminded them of past injustices, the family fined for painting their shutters the wrong shade of blue. The elderly couple threatened over a ramp that didn't meet community aesthetics. The parents warned for leaving toys on their porch. He didn't ask them to take sides. He just let them remember. By the night of the vote, word had spread. The clubhouse was packed, more residents than anyone had ever seen at an HOA meeting. The atmosphere was electric, charged with a quiet, collective frustration that had been simmering for years. Carol stood at the podium again, her stack of printed amendments in hand. She smiled tightly, masking her unease. She opened the floor for discussion, expecting only the usual polite silence. But this time, people spoke up. Homeowners questioned her wording. They asked for clarification. They demanded to know why such drastic measures were necessary. Some even accused the board of overreach. Carol's composure began to crack. Her responses grew defensive, then sharp. When the votes were finally tallied, the results were decisive. The amendments were rejected. The room erupted in murmurs, some of disbelief, others of quiet satisfaction. Carol's face drained of color. Years of unchallenged authority had just collapsed in front of everyone. For the first time, the board's word wasn't law. Ethan didn't smile or gloat. He simply nodded to a few neighbors and slipped out quietly. He'd won, but he knew what this meant. Cornered people don't surrender, they retaliate. And retaliation came swiftly. Within a week, Ethan received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney. The letter accused him of creating nuisance conditions through excessive vehicle activity and potential safety hazards. It demanded he cease his driveway business immediately or face a lawsuit for damages to community harmony. The language was absurdly formal, but the threat was real. Lawsuits cost money, and the HOA had deep pockets. They collected dues from every homeowner, while Ethan was just one man. Still, he wasn't intimidated. He gathered his records, contracts, permits, communications, and city rulings, and prepared his defense. He even reached out to a local news outlet, anonymously tipping them off about the HOA's campaign of harassment. The story hit online a few days later. Local HOA accused of bullying homeowner over driveway use. It spread fast. The article featured quotes from frustrated neighbors and a brief summary of Ethan's case, painting him as the underdog standing up to a power-hungry board. Comments flooded in from across the city. People shared their own HOA horror stories, expressing outrage at Maple Ridge's pettiness. The HOA tried to control the narrative, calling the report inaccurate. But the damage was done. Carol's pristine image as a protector of neighborhood values was shattered. Yet she didn't back down. When public pressure made legal action look bad, the HOA changed tactics. They weaponized bureaucracy instead. Inspectors began showing up at Ethan's property unannounced, claiming to check for code violations. They cited him for improper drainage, then for non-compliant fencing, then for unauthorized signage. None of it held up, but each citation cost time, stress, and paperwork. Ethan documented everything. Every visit, every letter, every attempt to intimidate him. He kept a binder full of evidence. Photos, timestamps, names. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was building a case. Neighbors rallied around him, offering help, sharing their own experiences, and quietly defying the HOA's rules. What began as his private battle had turned into something larger. A community standing up for itself. And that was exactly what terrified Carol. Late one evening, as the streetlights flickered and the neighborhood fell silent, Ethan stood by his window, watching the soft glow of his driveway lights. Two rented cars sat neatly parked, their reflections shimmering off the polished stone. He felt a strange mix of pride and exhaustion. He hadn't asked for this war. But now that it had begun, he was determined to see it through. Across the street, he noticed a car idling again. Carol's SUV. She didn't get out. She just sat there, watching his house like a hawk. For a brief moment, their eyes met through the glass. She looked angry, but beneath that anger was something else. Fear, because she knew she was losing control. And Ethan knew the fight was far from over. The HOA wasn't done yet. The next move would be their biggest one yet. And the most dangerous. The official notice arrived on a Monday morning, sealed in a heavy envelope with the HOA's emblem embossed in gold across the top. Ethan found it wedged between the usual mail. Bills, flyers, and advertisements. But it stood out immediately, the kind of letter that carried weight before it was even opened. Inside was the inevitable, a formal notice of civil action. The Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, represented by their counsel, was suing him for violation of community standards, nuisance creation, and breach of covenant. The language was grandiose, almost theatrical, the sort of thing meant to intimidate rather than inform. The lawsuit demanded not only the termination of his driveway business, but also the payment of damages for what they described as the measurable devaluation of neighborhood property values caused by thousands of commercial activities. They were asking for thousands of dollars in penalties of rentals. More than 80 months of rentals. He read every word slowly, twice, his expression unmoving. It wasn't a surprise. It was the final play he'd been expecting since the moment Carol Benson's SUV started appearing outside his house at night. The HOA had exhausted their letters, their amendments, their fines. Now they were going for the kill. But this time, Ethan was ready. He'd spent weeks preparing for this possibility, cataloging every interaction with the HOA, every citation, every attempt at harassment. He had photos, recordings, and a timeline of events stretching back to the very first letter. What had started as petty enforcement had turned into an orchestrated campaign of retaliation. And Ethan had proof. He also had something the HOA didn't: public support. The local news article had gained unexpected traction. It had been shared on community forums, discussed on neighborhood social media pages, and even picked up by a regional TV outlet. By now, Ethan had become something of a folk hero, the man who stood up to an out-of-control HA. People from nearby communities reached out to him with stories of their own, some offering advice, others encouragement. The HOA's leadership, meanwhile, had turned into a symbol of everything people hated about suburban overreach. Carol Benson's name was being mentioned with disdain in online threads and local discussions. Her once ironclad control over Maple Ridge had started to crack under the weight of bad publicity. But bad press wasn't enough to stop a lawsuit. Ethan met with a lawyer of his own, a calm, experienced man named Alex who specialized in property law and homeowner disputes. After reviewing the documents, Alex leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly. The HOA's case, he explained, was built on shaky ground. Their claims of nuisance were subjective. Their property devaluation argument had no evidence. And most importantly, their enforcement actions against Ethan showed clear signs of personal bias. They weren't trying to protect the neighborhood. They were trying to destroy him. Alex agreed to take the case, confident they could not only defend against the lawsuit, but potentially turn it into a countersuit for harassment and defamation. The weeks that followed became a slow grind of paperwork, filings, and hearings. The HOA presented itself as the guardian of community order, while Ethan was painted as a selfish rule breaker who had monetized his property at the expense of his neighbors. But the narrative didn't hold up well under scrutiny. Ethan's neighbors, the same ones who had quietly suffered under the HOA's rigid enforcement, began coming forward. Some wrote statements describing how they'd been unfairly fined, how Carol and her board had targeted residents for trivial issues. A few even admitted they had started renting out their own driveways after Ethan's example, legally and without issue. The HOA's credibility began to crumble in court. Carol herself testified, speaking with her usual sharp precision, but under questioning, her composure faltered. When asked to produce evidence that Ethan's driveway had harmed property values, she admitted they had none. When asked why Ethan's truck, legally parked, had been repeatedly cited, she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The judge wasn't impressed. As the hearing continued over several sessions, Ethan sat silently through each one, calm and methodical. He wasn't fighting just for himself anymore. He was fighting to expose the rot inside the HOA system that thrived on intimidation and control. Outside the courtroom, reporters began showing up. Cameras waited as he exited each session, their lights flashing against the courthouse steps. He never gave long statements, only brief comments about standing up for fairness and homeowners' rights. The story had become bigger than Maple Ridge. Behind closed doors, Carol's allies on the board began to fracture. Some wanted to settle quietly and avoid more humiliation. Others urged her to keep fighting. But Carol refused to back down. For her, it wasn't about money anymore. It was about pride. Losing to Ethan meant losing the identity she had built around her control of Maple Ridge. Then came the breaking point. During one of the later hearings, Ethan's lawyer presented new evidence. Emails obtained through discovery that showed Carol had instructed board members to find any possible violations on Ethan's property, whether legitimate or not. One message even mentioned making an example out of him so other residents don't get ideas. The courtroom went silent. The judge read the emails twice, frowning deeply. The tone, the intent, it was clear harassment. What had begun as a simple dispute over parking had turned into a personal vendetta. That revelation changed everything. The judge dismissed the HOA's nuisance claims and signaled that Ethan had grounds to countersue. Carol's face turned pale as the courtroom erupted into hushed whispers. Afterward, reporters surrounded Ethan as he stepped outside. His story: a homeowner fined for using his own driveway and then sued for fighting back, had become a local sensation. To the public, he wasn't just another resident caught in a legal fight. He was a symbol of defiance against petty authority. The HOA's reputation took a devastating hit. Attendance at their meetings plummeted. Homeowners began demanding transparency, even threatening to recall the board entirely. The quiet rebellion that had started months ago was now out in the open. Carol tried to hold it together, but the pressure was too much. Her leadership had become a liability, her authority a joke. Rumors swirled that several board members were preparing to resign before things got worse. Ethan, however, remained cautious. Victories in court could be unpredictable, and Carol was desperate enough to try anything. He knew she wouldn't leave without one final attempt to regain control. Something drastic, something reckless. And he was right, because just as the case seemed to be turning in his favor, a new twist appeared. A sudden inspection from the county's zoning department, citing an anonymous tip about unpermitted construction on his property. The timing was no coincidence. Carol wasn't done fighting. She was done playing fair. And this time, her next move wouldn't just threaten Ethan's business. It would threaten everything he'd built. The zoning notice was delivered in the same cold, bureaucratic style as every HOA letter that had come before it. Short, clinical, and dripping with implied threat. Notice of inspection and violation potential. Unpermitted structural modification on private property. Ethan stared at the paper on his kitchen counter, the words swimming in front of him. The letter accused him of adding non-approved permanent fixtures to his driveway, a violation that could, if proven, lead to hefty fines or even mandatory demolition. The accusation was vague, citing only an anonymous complaint. But he didn't need to guess who had filed it. Carol Benson's fingerprints were all over it. The timing was too precise. The HOA lawsuit had just begun to unravel, their credibility collapsing under public scrutiny. Now, suddenly, county inspectors were knocking on Ethan's door. This wasn't a coincidence. It was retaliation disguised as procedure. The kind that couldn't be traced back easily, the kind meant to exhaust him. That afternoon, a white pickup truck from the county zoning department pulled up to his house. Two inspectors stepped out, clipboards in hand, their reflective vests catching the sun. Ethan greeted them calmly. They were polite, professional, and visibly uncomfortable. Just doing their jobs. They walked the property, measuring, taking photos, jotting notes. Their attention lingered on the small sign Ethan had installed by his driveway. The one that read, "Reserved parking. Permit holders only." It was bolted into a short concrete base, barely more than a few inches tall. But apparently, that was enough to trigger a report of unauthorized structural installation. The lead inspector sighed quietly as he finished his notes. He explained that complaints like these were common in HOA communities, usually from feuding neighbors. "We'll file the report," he said. But honestly, there's nothing serious here. Still, he had to follow procedure. Ethan understood. He thanked them for their professionalism and watched as they drove off, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. He exhaled slowly. The inspection hadn't uncovered anything serious, but that wasn't the point. The point was to remind him that Carol could reach into every corner of his life, twisting the system to harass him under the guise of legality. For the next few weeks, it became a pattern. A city sanitation worker arrived unannounced, claiming there had been complaints about oil runoff. from his driveway. Then came a noise complaint about frequent vehicle movement during late hours. Each accusation evaporated under scrutiny, but each one cost Ethan time and energy. He was starting to see the broader strategy. Carol had lost control of the narrative in the courtroom, so now she was waging a war of attrition. Death by paperwork, by inconvenience, by stress. But what she didn't realize was that Ethan wasn't fighting alone anymore. The residents of Maple Ridge had begun to rally around him, not out of pity, but out of shared frustration. They were tired of the endless rules, the arrogance, the fear of stepping out of line. Many of them had lived in quiet resentment for years, too afraid to challenge the board. Now, with Ethan standing at the center of it all, they finally had someone willing to lead the resistance. Neighbors began attending HOA meetings en masse, demanding transparency and accountability. They asked where their dues were going, why legal funds were being used to target a single homeowner, and what the board's real motives were. The pressure mounted. Carol responded with the same condescending tone she'd always used, insisting that community order required firm leadership. But the room no longer nodded along. They stared back at her with crossed arms and cold eyes. The illusion of control was slipping through her fingers. Ethan, meanwhile, was building his next move. He wasn't content with just defending himself. He wanted to end this once and for all. He compiled all the records of harassment, the zoning inspections, the anonymous complaints, the citations that went nowhere. He documented dates, times, even the language used in each notice. He then compared them with the emails uncovered during the lawsuit, emails that hinted at Carol's influence beyond the HOA board. The pattern was undeniable. Through subtle pressure and personal connections, Carol had used her position to weaponize local departments against a private citizen. It wasn't just unethical. It bordered on abuse of authority. Ethan's lawyer, Alex, was methodical. Together, they drafted a formal countersuit, not just against the HOA as an entity, but against Carol personally. The charges included harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It was bold, risky, and sure to escalate the fight. But it was the only way to stop her. The news broke a week later. Headlines once again lit up local forums. Homeowner countersues HO president for harassment. The story spread fast, reigniting public interest. By now, the media narrative was entirely on Ethan's side. He wasn't a rebel. He was a victim of unchecked power, and Carol had become the villain of her own community. The next HOA meeting was chaos. Dozens of residents filled the room, demanding answers. Carol sat at the front, pale and rigid, as voices rose around her. Questions turned into accusations. Some called for her resignation outright. Others shouted about misuse of funds and the embarrassment she'd brought to Maple Ridge. She tried to maintain order, banging her gavel repeatedly, but no one was listening anymore. That night, after the meeting finally dissolved into shouting and slammed doors, Carol drove past Ethan's house one last time. The lights from his driveway illuminated the quiet street. 3 cars parked neatly in their spaces. Renters who waved politely as they left. She stopped at the corner and sat there for several minutes, staring. The empire she'd built through fear was gone. Her board was splintering, her reputation ruined, and the lawsuit she had launched had become her downfall. Still, she wasn't finished. 2 days later, a rumor spread through the neighborhood. Carol had resigned as HOA president. But what most people didn't know was that before she stepped down, she had taken one last action. She had emptied a large portion of the HOA's legal defense fund, paying herself and the association's attorney as reimbursement for administrative damages. It was a desperate move, one meant to shield herself from the financial fallout she knew was coming. But it also left the HOA nearly bankrupt. When Ethan heard the news, he felt no triumph, only exhaustion. The war that had consumed nearly a year of his life was finally burning itself out. He'd stood his ground, endured every tactic, and come out stronger. But Maple Ridge itself was left fractured. its perfect lawns and pristine mailboxes concealing a neighborhood divided by resentment and distrust. The following week, the county dropped all pending investigations against him. The inspectors never returned. The noise complaints stopped. Even the letters stopped coming. For the first time in months, Ethan could step outside in the morning, coffee in hand, and feel the quiet peace that had once drawn him to Maple Ridge. His driveway, bathed in the soft glow of sunrise, no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like his again. But even as calm returned, a small, persistent question lingered in his mind. What would happen next? Because while Carol had vanished from the HOA, rumors suggested she wasn't done entirely. Some said she had filed a personal complaint against him with the State Homeowner Association Bureau. Others whispered she was planning to sue the HOA itself for wrongful removal. Ethan didn't know if any of it was true. What he did know was that people like Carol didn't accept defeat easily. And though the neighborhood finally seemed at peace, a storm always gathers just before it clears.